In the early hours of December 23rd, 1948, 7 men walked their final steps through the corridors of Sugamo Prison in Tokyo. These weren't ordinary criminals. They were generals, admirals, and former prime ministers who had once commanded millions and controlled an empire stretching across half the Pacific. On this cold December morning, they would face the ultimate consequence for their actions during the darkest chapter of the 20th century. What they said in those final moments reveals something profound about honor, responsibility, and the weight of history itself. Some maintained their dignity with traditional poetry. Others offered confessions that had taken years to surface. And one man's words would echo through history as both an apology and a defiant statement about the nature of war itself. Tonight, we examine these final testimonies, not just of war criminals, but of human beings confronting their mortality while grappling with the immense consequences of their choices. The story begins not in 1948, but centuries earlier, when the concept of honorable death became deeply embedded in Japanese culture. For over 1,000 years, Japanese leaders had faced disgrace or defeat through ritual death. Seppuku. This wasn't mere self-destruction, but a carefully choreographed ceremony that allowed a warrior to maintain dignity even in failure. The samurai believed the soul resided in the belly, making disembowelment the most honest form of death, literally opening oneself before judgment. Those who performed seppuku properly were remembered with honor, their families protected from shame. It was considered so sacred that only the warrior class could perform it. Common criminals were simply executed, denied this path to redemption. By the early 20th century, seppuku had evolved from battlefield expedient to formal capital punishment for disgraced nobles. The condemned would wear white ceremonial robes, compose death poems, and face their end with stoic dignity. Behind them stood a trusted companion, the kaishakunin, who would mercifully end their suffering with a swift sword stroke to the neck. This cultural backdrop shaped how Japanese leaders approached death and dishonor for generations. When Japan entered World War II, its military leaders carried these ancient concepts of duty and sacrifice into a modern industrial war that would reshape the entire Pacific region. The war itself began with calculated aggression. In 1931, Japanese forces staged the Mukden Incident, using it as pretext to occupy Manchuria. 6 years later came the full invasion of China, marked by atrocities that shocked the world. The 1937 massacre at Nanking alone claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Then came Pearl Harbor in December 1941, dragging America into a war that would consume the Pacific for 4 bloody years. But as 1945 dawned, Japan's position became increasingly hopeless. American bombers reduced major cities to ash. The atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated a new level of destructive power. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that many Japanese heard in stunned disbelief. Within weeks, American occupation forces under General Douglas MacArthur began arresting suspected war criminals. At the top of their list was Hideki Tojo, the former prime minister who had led Japan into war against the United States. On September 11th, 1945, American soldiers surrounded a modest house in suburban Tokyo. Inside waited Hideki Tojo, the man many considered the architect of Japan's wartime aggression. As the Americans approached, they heard a gunshot. Bursting through the door, they found Tojo slumped in a chair, blood streaming from a self-inflicted wound to his chest. He had attempted the traditional path of seppuku, but botched the execution. The bullet missed his heart, lodging instead in his stomach. As American medics rushed to save his life, Tojo whispered his regrets, not for his war crimes, but for his failure to die properly. The weakened former premier muttered that he was very sorry it was taking him so long to die, and spoke of the Greater East Asia War as justified and righteous. Even facing capture, Tojo remained convinced of Japan's cause. This failed attempt at ritual death marked a turning point. Ancient traditions were giving way to modern justice. Instead of dying by his own hand as a samurai, Tojo would face trial in an international court, a concept that would have been incomprehensible to his ancestors. The Americans saved Tojo's life specifically so he could stand trial. For nearly 3 years, He and 27 other defendants would face charges before the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. The proceedings, held in the former Japanese War Ministry building, would determine who among Japan's leaders bore responsibility for the war's atrocities. But even as this new form of justice unfolded, the condemned men would draw upon centuries-old traditions to face their ultimate fate. The courtroom where Japan's leaders faced judgment carried profound symbolism. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in the very building where many of the wartime decisions had been made. Representatives from 11 allied nations served as judges, with prosecutors presenting evidence of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. For 2.5 years, the tribunal heard testimony from 419 witnesses and examined over 4,300 pieces of evidence. The prosecution methodically built their case, documenting the systematic brutality that had characterized Japan's conduct throughout the war. Hideki Tojo emerged as the central figure among the defendants. As prime minister from 1941 to 1944, he had presided over Japan's most aggressive expansion. During his testimony, he accepted responsibility for key decisions, including the attack on Pearl Harbor. But he maintained that Japan had acted in self-defense, forced into war by American economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure. The other defendants included some of the most notorious figures of the Pacific War. General Iwane Matsui had commanded forces during the Nanking Massacre, where Japanese troops engaged in weeks of systematic violence against Chinese civilians. General Kenji Doihara, known as the Lawrence of Manchuria, had spent decades engineering Japanese expansion in China through espionage and subversion. Each man's story reflected different aspects of Japan's path to war. Some were career military officers who had risen through the ranks during Japan's modernization. Others were politicians who had tried to navigate between military demands and diplomatic pressures. But all had been swept up in the ultra-nationalist fervor that gripped Japan in the 1930s. As the evidence mounted, it became clear that several defendants would face death sentences. The question became not whether they would be executed, but how they would face their fate. In November 1948, the verdicts were announced. All remaining defendants were found guilty on at least one charge. 7 were sentenced to death by hanging. 16 received life imprisonment. 2 had died during the lengthy proceedings. The condemned men had weeks to prepare for their execution. During this time, they would be guided by a Buddhist priest who would help them confront not just their mortality, but the weight of their actions during the war. Shinsho Hanayama was not what most people expected of a Buddhist priest ministering to war criminals. Scholarly and compassionate, he had volunteered to serve as chaplain at Sugamo Prison, knowing he would be working with some of the most reviled men in Japan. Hanayama belonged to the true Pure Land Buddhist sect, which emphasized salvation through faith rather than works. This doctrine would prove particularly relevant when counseling men struggling with the enormity of their wartime actions. Unlike the traditional Buddhist concept of karma determining one's fate through past actions, Pure Land Buddhism offered the possibility of redemption through sincere repentance. The priest spent countless hours with the condemned men during their final weeks. He listened to confessions, offered spiritual guidance, and helped them prepare for death according to Buddhist traditions. Most importantly, he encouraged them to confront honestly what they had done during the war. For General Iwane Matsui, this spiritual counseling proved particularly significant. 2 weeks before his execution, Matsui spoke at length about the events at Nanking, telling Hanayama that he was deeply ashamed of what had occurred there. This confession represented a remarkable transformation for a man who had spent years defending his actions. Hanayama later wrote that Matsui described how, after Japanese forces entered Nanking, he had ordered that Chinese victims be included in memorial services for fallen Japanese soldiers. This gesture, while insufficient to undo the massive violence that had occurred, suggested that Matsui retained some sense of common humanity even amid the brutality of war. The priest's influence extended beyond individual counseling. He helped establish routines and rituals that brought some measure of peace to the condemned men's final days. They were allowed to pray together, write letters to their families, and compose traditional death poems. These activities connected them to centuries of Japanese traditions surrounding honorable death. But Hanayama also pushed them towards something that had been largely absent from traditional seppuku: genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing toward others, while samurai ritual focused on personal honor and duty to one's lord. The Buddhist chaplain emphasized responsibility toward all living beings. This spiritual preparation would prove crucial as the execution date approached. The days leading up to December 23, 1948, fell into a careful routine at Sugamo Prison. The 7 condemned men were allowed to spend their final weeks writing letters, receiving visitors, and engaging in religious observances. American authorities, aware of the historical significance of the executions, documented these activities with unusual thoroughness. Hideki Tojo used his time to compose numerous letters and poems. He remained largely unrepentant about Japan's wartime actions, maintaining that the country had fought for survival against Western imperialism. Yet his writings also revealed a man grappling with the reality that his strategies had led to Japan's devastation and the deaths of millions. General Iwani Matsui, by contrast, spent his final weeks in deep religious contemplation. His conversations with Buddhist chaplain Hanayama had clearly affected him profoundly. Where he had once justified the violence at Nanking as military necessity, he now spoke of shame and responsibility. The other condemned men each processed their fate differently. General Kenji Doihara, the master spy whose machinations had helped precipitate the war, maintained an air of professional detachment. He treated his execution as simply another operation to be completed with efficiency and honor. General Seishiro Itagaki, who had played a key role in Japan's expansion into Manchuria, was the only one among the 7 to express explicit contrition for his actions. His case highlighted the complex moral landscape the men navigated, acknowledging wrongdoing while maintaining that they had served their emperor faithfully. During these final weeks, the condemned men were also allowed to meet with family members. These visits were carefully monitored and limited, but they provided opportunities for final reconciliations and goodbyes. Some wives and children had already distanced themselves from the convicted war criminals, unable to bear the shame of association. Others remained loyal, viewing their relatives as victims of circumstances beyond their control. The men also used this time to arrange for the disposition of their personal effects. Traditional items were distributed to family members, while more mundane possessions were given to fellow prisoners or donated to the prison. Tojo famously gave his military decorations to an American guard, a gesture that somehow bridged the gap between former enemies. As December 23rd approached, the routines at Sugamo took on an increasingly ritualistic quality. The condemned men rose each morning, knowing they were one day closer to their fate, yet they maintained remarkable composure. This was, perhaps, the final expression of the cultural values that had shaped their entire lives, the importance of facing death with dignity. But behind this stoic facade, each man was preparing for a very different kind of final statement. Understanding the final words of these men requires first understanding who they were and how they had arrived at this moment. Each of the 7 condemned war criminals represented a different aspect of Japan's path to militarism and ultimate defeat. Hideki Tojo stood as the most recognizable figure among them. Born into a military family in 1884, he had followed a path that seemed destined for leadership. His father had been a general, and young Hideki displayed the rigid discipline and attention to detail that would earn him the nickname Razor among his peers. Tojo's rise through the military hierarchy coincided with Japan's emergence as a modern imperial power. He served in the Russo-Japanese War, studied military techniques in Germany, and gradually became convinced that Japan's survival required aggressive expansion. By the time he became prime minister in October 1941, he viewed war with the United States as inevitable. Yet for all his authority during the war years, Tojo was not the absolute dictator that many Americans imagined. He had to navigate complex relationships with the emperor, the military services, and various political factions. His failure to achieve decisive victory led to his forced resignation in July 1944, well before Japan's final surrender. General Iwani Matsui represented a different strand of Japanese militarism. Born in 1878, he became the Army's foremost expert on China, speaking the language fluently and advocating for Asian unity under Japanese leadership. His Pan-Asian ideology initially envisioned cooperation between Asian nations against Western imperialism, but Matsui's idealism became corrupted by the brutal realities of warfare. When he led Japanese forces during the 1937 attack on Nanking, he proved unable or unwilling to control his troops' behavior. The resulting massacre became one of the war's most notorious atrocities, forever linking his name to the systematic violence that characterized Japan's occupation of China. General Kenji Doihara embodied the shadowy world of intelligence and subversion that had paved Japan's path to war. Known as the Lawrence of Manchuria for his role in separating that region from China, Doihara had spent decades engineering conflicts and installing puppet governments throughout Northeast Asia. His methods were subtle but devastating. Rather than relying solely on military force, Doihara used bribery, blackmail, and political manipulation to achieve Japanese objectives. The Mukden Incident of 1931, which provided the pretext for Japan's occupation of Manchuria, bore the hallmarks of his strategic thinking. The other condemned men, Generals Seishiro Itagaki, Heitaro Kimura, and Akira Muto, along with former Foreign Minister Koki Hirota, had each contributed to Japan's wartime policies in their own ways. Some had been battlefield commanders who had implemented brutal occupation policies. Others had been administrators who had facilitated the exploitation of conquered territories. What united them all was their belief that they had been serving their emperor and country faithfully. None had acted purely from personal ambition or sadistic cruelty. They were products of a system that had convinced them that extreme measures were necessary for national survival. This conviction would shape how each man prepared to face his final moments. December 22, 1948, passed quietly at Sugamo Prison. The 7 condemned men spent their final evening in prayer, correspondence, and quiet conversation. American guards maintained their vigilant watch, but the atmosphere was more solemn than tense. Each man spent time alone with Buddhist chaplain Hanayama, participating in final rituals and making peace with their approaching fate. These private conversations were never fully recorded, but Hanayama later wrote about the spiritual transformation he witnessed in several of the prisoners. The men were also allowed to gather together one final time in the prison chapel. As the senior figure among them, General Matsui was asked to lead the group in traditional banzai cheers for Emperor Hirohito. This ceremony connected them to centuries of Japanese tradition, while acknowledging the sovereign for whom they claimed to have fought. Writing materials were provided so the men could compose final letters and poems. These documents, later preserved in American archives, reveal remarkable insights into how they understood their fate. Some maintained their innocence of war crimes while accepting responsibility for military failure. Others expressed genuine remorse for the suffering their actions had caused. The traditional death poem, or Jisei no Ku, held special significance in Japanese culture. These brief verses were expected to capture the essence of one's life and final thoughts. For the condemned war criminals, composing these poems represented one last opportunity to define how they would be remembered. Tojo's final poem reflected his continued belief in the righteousness of Japan's cause. It is goodbye. Over the mountains I go today, to the bosom of Buddha. So happy am I. The verse suggested both acceptance of death and confidence that his actions had been justified. General Matsui's poem took a different tone, reflecting his spiritual awakening under Hanayama's guidance. As Mount Fuji towers above the surrounding peaks, so does the mercy of the Buddha tower above all worldly things. This verse suggested both humility and hope for divine forgiveness. As midnight approached, the prison grew quiet. The condemned men settled into their cells for their final night, knowing that dawn would bring their appointment with the gallows. Guards reported that most slept peacefully, having found some measure of acceptance through their religious preparations. But the ultimate test of their spiritual transformation would come not in the darkness of their cells, but in their final words before the trap doors opened. At exactly midnight on December 23, 1948, the executions began. The 7 condemned men were divided into 2 groups to accommodate the limited number of gallows. The first group of 4, Tojo, Doihara, Matsui, and Muto, were led to the execution chamber first. Each man spent a final hour alone with Buddhist chaplain Hanayama before being brought to the gallows. This last spiritual consultation allowed them to make final confessions and receive Buddhist blessings. The chaplain later described these moments as intensely moving, as men who had once wielded enormous power faced their mortality with remarkable dignity. The execution chamber itself was spare and functional, designed by American engineers to carry out the court's sentences efficiently. 13 steps led up to the gallows platform, where 4 nooses awaited the condemned. Allied representatives, including officials from the United States, China, Britain, and the Soviet Union, served as witnesses to ensure the sentences were properly carried out. When the first group was led into the chamber, they walked steadily without assistance. American executioners, led by Sergeant John Wood, carried out their duties with professional competence. Each condemned man was fitted with a black hood before the noose was placed around his neck. In his final statement, Tojo apologized for the atrocities committed by the Japanese military and urged the American military to show compassion toward the Japanese people, who had suffered devastating air attacks and atomic bombings. This represented a significant departure from his earlier defiant stance, suggesting that his weeks in prison had led to some degree of spiritual transformation. The other men's final words were briefer, but equally significant. Matsui spoke of his remorse for the violence at Nanking, and his hope that his death might contribute to peace between Japan and China. Doihara maintained his professional composure, treating his execution as a final military duty to be completed with honor. After all preparations were complete, the trapdoors opened simultaneously. The first 4 condemned men died quickly, their necks broken by the carefully calculated drop. Prison doctors confirmed their deaths within minutes, and their bodies were removed to make way for the second group. The remaining 3 men, Itagaki, Kimura, and Hirota, followed the same procedure 30 minutes later. Each maintained the same dignified bearing that had characterized their predecessors. Their final words echoed themes of responsibility, remorse, and hope for Japan's future. General Itagaki, who had been the only one to express explicit contrition during the trial, used his final moments to again acknowledge the wrongfulness of Japan's wartime actions. His words suggested genuine understanding of the suffering Japan had inflicted on other nations. By dawn on December 23rd, all 7 executions had been completed. The bodies were quickly cremated, and the ashes scattered over the Pacific Ocean to prevent the creation of martyr shrines. This decision reflected American concerns that the executed men might become symbols for Japanese extremists seeking to justify the war. The role of Buddhism in these final moments extended far beyond simple spiritual comfort. Buddhist chaplain Hanayama had shepherded several of the condemned men through a profound transformation during their final weeks, where they had once justified their actions through concepts of imperial loyalty and national survival. They came to understand their responsibility for individual human suffering. This transformation was particularly evident in the case of General Matsui. His conversations with Hanayama had led him to acknowledge not just military failure, but moral failure. His confession regarding the Nanking Massacre represented one of the most significant admissions of war guilt by any high-ranking Japanese officer. The Buddhist concept of karma played a complex role in these final preparations. Traditional Buddhist teachings suggested that the men's current predicament was the inevitable result of their past actions. Yet Pure Land Buddhism, as practiced by Hanayama, offered the possibility of redemption through sincere repentance and faith in Amida Buddha's mercy. This theological framework allowed the condemned men to accept their fate while maintaining some hope for spiritual salvation. Rather than viewing their execution purely as punishment, they could understand it as an opportunity for spiritual advancement through acceptance of responsibility. The death poems composed by the condemned men reflected various degrees of this spiritual understanding. Some, like Tojo's verse, maintained themes of personal honor and imperial loyalty. Others, particularly Matsui's poem, suggested genuine humility and hope for divine forgiveness. Hanayama later wrote about his experience ministering to the war criminals, describing it as one of the most challenging and rewarding periods of his religious career. He had witnessed the power of Buddhist teaching to transform even the most hardened individuals when they genuinely confronted the consequences of their actions. The priest's account, published as The Way of Deliverance, became an important document in understanding both the executions themselves and the broader question of how individuals and nations could find redemption after committing terrible acts. But the influence of these final words extended beyond the realm of personal spirituality into the complex politics of post-war Japan. The execution of Japan's wartime leaders on December 23, 1948, marked both an end and a beginning. It concluded the formal process of holding Japan accountable for its wartime actions, but it also initiated decades of debate about the nature of justice, responsibility, and reconciliation. The final words spoken by the condemned men became part of the historical record, preserved in American archives and Japanese accounts. These statements revealed the complex ways that individuals processed responsibility for collective actions. Some maintained their innocence while accepting their fate. Others acknowledged wrongdoing while insisting they had acted from patriotic motives. Perhaps most significantly, several of the men expressed genuine remorse for the suffering Japan had inflicted on other nations. These admissions of guilt, while limited in scope, provided important precedents for Japan's post-war reckoning with its wartime actions. The Buddhist framework within which these final statements were made also had lasting influence. The concept that even the most serious wrongdoing could be addressed through sincere repentance became important in post-war Japanese discussions of war responsibility. This provided a cultural bridge between acknowledging guilt and maintaining national pride. However, the legacy of these executions remained controversial in Japan. Many Japanese viewed the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal as victor's justice imposed by the occupying powers. The fact that Emperor Hirohito was not prosecuted while his subordinates faced death sentences struck many as fundamentally unfair. This controversy was complicated by the fact that several of the executed men, including Tojo and Matsui, were later enshrined at Yasukuni Shrine, alongside other Japanese war dead. Visits to the shrine by Japanese political leaders have repeatedly caused diplomatic tensions with China and Korea, countries that suffered under Japanese occupation. The shrine issue reflects the broader challenge Japan has faced in coming to terms with its wartime past. While some Japanese embrace the repentance expressed by condemned war criminals like Matsui, others prefer to remember them as patriots who died for their country. This tension between acknowledging wrongdoing and maintaining national honor continues to influence Japanese politics and diplomacy. The final words of the executed leaders remain relevant because they captured both perspectives, accepting responsibility while maintaining that their actions were motivated by loyalty to Japan. The Buddhist elements of their final statements also contributed to the development of post-war Japanese Buddhism. The faith's emphasis on compassion and the possibility of redemption became important themes in how Japanese religious leaders addressed questions of war guilt and national reconciliation. The execution of Japanese war leaders was unprecedented in several ways, particularly in how the condemned men faced their fate. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, where several Nazi leaders took their own lives to avoid execution, all of the condemned Japanese leaders accepted their sentences and faced death with remarkable composure. This difference reflected deep cultural distinctions between Japanese and German approaches to honor and death. While Nazi ideology ultimately collapsed in the face of defeat, leaving its adherents with little philosophical framework for understanding their fate, Japanese leaders could draw upon centuries of tradition regarding honorable death. The concept of seppuku provided these men with a cultural template for accepting death while maintaining dignity. Though they were not permitted to die by their own hand, they could approach execution with the same mental preparation that samurai had used for ritual suicide. This included composing death poems, making peace with family members, and engaging in spiritual purification. The role of Buddhist chaplain Hanayama was also distinctive. While German war criminals received religious counsel, none experienced the kind of systematic spiritual guidance that Hanayama provided. His work with the condemned men represented a unique fusion of traditional Japanese approaches to death and Buddhist concepts of redemption. The final statements made by the Japanese leaders also differed significantly from those of their German counterparts. While some Nazi leaders used their final moments to reassert their ideology or blame others for Germany's defeat, the Japanese leaders generally accepted responsibility for their roles in the war while maintaining their personal honor. This acceptance of responsibility was particularly significant, given Japanese cultural concepts of collective shame and family honor. By acknowledging their guilt, even in limited ways, these men were protecting their families and subordinates from continued persecution. The Buddhist framework within which they made these statements also provided a model for broader Japanese reconciliation with wartime enemies. The emphasis on sincere repentance as a path to redemption became important in post-war Japanese diplomacy, particularly with Asian neighbors who had suffered under occupation. However, this same framework also allowed for continued controversy. The belief that sincere repentance could lead to spiritual redemption meant that the executed leaders could be remembered as both war criminals and reformed individuals who had found peace before death. The final words of Japanese leaders before execution continue to resonate in contemporary discussions of justice, responsibility, and reconciliation. Their statements provide insights into how individuals process collective guilt and how societies can move forward after committing terrible acts. The Buddhist emphasis on sincere repentance as a path to redemption has influenced modern approaches to transitional justice. Truth and reconciliation commissions in various countries have drawn upon similar concepts, focusing on acknowledgement of wrongdoing rather than purely punitive measures. The tension between individual responsibility and collective action that marked these final statements remains relevant in contemporary debates about war crimes and crimes against humanity. The condemned Japanese leaders struggled with questions that continue to face political and military leaders today. When does loyalty to country justify extreme measures? How can individuals maintain personal honor while acknowledging participation in collective wrongdoing? The role of religious and cultural frameworks in processing guilt and seeking redemption also remains important. The Buddhist concepts that guided Hanayama's work with the condemned men provide models for how spiritual traditions can contribute to healing after conflict. Perhaps most significantly, the final words of these executed leaders demonstrate the complex relationship between justice and reconciliation. Their expressions of remorse, however limited, provided foundations for Japan's post-war relationships with former enemies. Yet their continued veneration by some Japanese shows the difficulty of achieving true reconciliation. The shrine controversies that continue to affect Japanese diplomacy trace directly back to the execution of these 7 men and the ambiguous legacy of their final statements. Their words captured both genuine repentance and continued pride in Japanese actions, creating a legacy that remains difficult to interpret clearly. Modern Japan continues to grapple with questions raised by these final moments at Sugamo Prison. How should a nation remember leaders who committed terrible acts while serving what they believed were righteous causes? Can acknowledgement of wrongdoing coexist with respect for individual sacrifice and patriotic motivation? These questions remain relevant not just for Japan, but for any society confronting a difficult past. The final words of condemned war criminals provide no easy answers, but they illuminate the complex process through which individuals and nations can seek to understand and redeem themselves after committing grave wrongs. In the cold hours before dawn on December 23, 1948, 7 men faced the ultimate consequences of their choices during history's most destructive conflict. Their final words, preserved in archives and memoirs, reveal the profound complexity of human nature when confronted with ultimate responsibility. These were not monsters, though they had participated in monstrous acts. They were products of a culture that valued loyalty, honor, and sacrifice, virtues that had been corrupted by ultranationalism and militarism. In their final moments, some found ways to acknowledge this corruption while maintaining their personal dignity. The transformation that several underwent during their final weeks, guided by Buddhist chaplain Hanayama, demonstrates the human capacity for genuine repentance, even in the face of overwhelming guilt. General Matsui's acknowledgement of shame regarding the Nanking massacre and Tojo's final appeal for compassion toward the Japanese people suggested that even the most hardened leaders could recognize their moral failures when confronted with death. Yet these same final statements also revealed the limits of individual redemption in the face of collective tragedy. No amount of personal repentance could restore the millions of lives lost during Japan's wartime aggression. No expression of remorse could undo the systematic brutality that had characterized Japanese occupation policies throughout Asia. The Buddhist framework within which these men prepared for death provided both comfort and challenge. It offered the possibility of spiritual redemption while demanding honest confrontation with the consequences of their actions. This spiritual dimension added depth to what might otherwise have been merely a legal proceeding. The legacy of these final words continues to influence Japanese society and international relations. The tension between acknowledging wrongdoing and maintaining national pride remains unresolved, as evidenced by continuing controversies over war memorials and historical interpretation. Perhaps the most important lesson from these final moments is that individuals retain moral agency, even within the most oppressive systems. The condemned leaders had choices throughout their careers, and their final words revealed their ultimate understanding of those choices. Some maintained defiance, others found genuine repentance. Most struggled with the complex relationship between personal honor and collective responsibility. Their final words remind us that history is made by individuals making choices under enormous pressure. Understanding those choices and their consequences remains essential for preventing similar tragedies in the future. The gallows at Sugamo Prison are long gone, but the words spoken there continue to echo through history, challenging us to confront difficult questions about justice, responsibility, and the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.